news is important because on the one hand, it can help you kind of understand what is happening to people around you and you can learn about what they're doing. On the other hand, it can also help you understand what is happening in the world.
You want to have well-informed citizens in a democratic society. Because if you don't have that, the risk is polarization and division in society.
One time we had a conversation with one of our broadcasting clients and we talked about developments in the news and fake news and some of the worries that we had. And so we discussed whether it would be good if Deloitte would do a study on that.
The state of the news right now in the Netherlands is still relatively good. I think the majority of the people in the Netherlands still have trust in the news, but this is something that's definitely under pressure.
We looked at political developments, economic developments, societal developments, technological developments.
We're here now at Beeld en Geluid in Hilversum on the Media Park. I think this is an iconic building for radio and television. And we thought this was, this epic building is also the best location to launch our report, hoping that from here, a lot of the initiatives will be picked up.
And here we are at Beeld en Geluid in Hilversum. A warm welcome to all of you here in Hilversum and of course everyone that's joining online. Today we're going to present our report, The Future of News. We will do that this afternoon with my colleagues Jan-Piet Nelissen and Maaike van Velzen. And later on we are very pleased that we also have Peter Smet from the Dutch Journalism Fund and Arno Otto from the industry-wide coalition of Dutch media organizations. If you have any questions during this session, please save them for the end of the session. And if you are joining online, you can just put them in the chat. We have our colleague Jens here, who is monitoring the chat. So those questions will also be handled later on. But first, over to Jan-Piet. Tell us a bit more about the report.
Please, thanks Natalie, happy to do so. I'll take you all a little bit through the content of the report, what we did and what some of our conclusions were towards the scenarios. And then Maaike will take over to explain the initiatives that we identified. And we is not just Deloitte, it's us plus 25 to 30 different companies, institutions, research agencies, both from the Netherlands and the wider Europe that contributed either through expert interviews or through a number of roundtable sessions that we did on identifying trends, scenarios, and of course the initiatives. And I want to thank each and every one of you. There's a lot of them here in Beeld en Geluid. Thanks for contributing, thanks for coming, but also to those that couldn't make it, e.g. because they live outside of the Netherlands. Also to you, thanks a lot for contributing and being online. For us, I think a great day to be able to explain the results. So without further ado, let me take you through that a little bit. We started off by defining the value of news, after which we went to defining some of the certainties and uncertainties that I'll talk about. Those resulted in in the 4 scenarios that we described. And then, most importantly, Mike is going to talk about that, the initiatives that we suggest we either as an individual or as society or as a news company or as a tech company take to preserve the value of news in the best way possible. Because that's what it's about. It's about the value of news. Natalie, shall I? Thank you. Click next. So, as I said, this was the start. What is the value of news? How do we define it? Why is it important? Many people have written about it. This is what we took from all of that, plus our own opinion. So we believe the value of news lies in 2 important functions. One being the forum function and one being the control function. The forum function facilitates debate by expressing diverse opinions and viewpoints. For that, you need two things that you can also see here on the slide. One, a well-functioning news ecosystem where all the players and news generators and distributors can make a decent amount of money and can continue their task. And on the other hand, you also need citizens that have the ability and the literacy to consume the media in or analog and or digital ways. So media and digital literacy are important as well. The other function is the control function. It's a sort of the watchdog. The news is the watchdog for those in power. And with that we mean both government, that everybody thinks of, but also the people in power in institutions and companies. For that, the two most important things that one needs for a good control function are independent journalists on the one hand, and on the other hand, a government that also allows this and also upholds the constitutional rights to media and journalism, such as the freedom of expression, freedom of media, freedom of press, freedom of information. So that was the starting point. And the idea is, what is the value today and how can we preserve the best possible value of news of these two important functions going forward in the future? And we picked 2030. 2030 is not too far away. If you pick 2040 or 2050, who cares? I'm retired. If you pick 2 years, I can't influence it, but this is something that we can oversee and influence. So, looking at 2030, we identified trends. And why is it important to look at that? Well, there's a couple of reasons here. Sometimes you just don't see the possibilities, and that may hurt you. Because you miss an opportunity, e.g., as this page says, at DEC they didn't see the opportunity for computers. Margaret Thatcher overlooked the possibility that she could become prime minister. And the general on the bottom right-hand side, that were his famous last words, because he couldn't foresee a possible future where striking distance was larger than he thought. The same happened to Shell in the 70s. They didn't foresee a future where there was an oil crisis. And Shell then said, we don't want that to happen anymore. Let's prepare ourselves for more possible futures than just the one that we currently base our strategy on. And that's how scenario planning and scenario thinking started out, and that's what we used as well for our study. Scenario planning starts off with looking at what are the developments. And so we looked at all the developments in the industry. And we have a tool for that. It scrapes the internet and looks at lots of articles, plus all those interviews and workshops I talked about. So we identified 96 developments in news. And we put them in 4 quadrants, as you see here on the page. On the vertical axis, the impact. And we were most interested in things that have a high impact on the value of news, hence the top ones, and we grayed out the bottom ones. And we looked at the level of certainty or uncertainty, if you like. If you look at the top left quadrant, those are the things we are relatively certain about that are going to happen. Which means they are not coming back in our scenarios because those will happen in any of the scenarios that we describe. So let me give you a couple of examples of things that we're relatively certain about. The use of artificial intelligence for news creation, content creation, is increasing and will continue to increase towards 2030. The rise of fake news is rising and will increase towards 2030. The use of digital platforms, social media platforms is increasing, and we expect it to increase, which means that more and more people use news in an indirect way, not directly from the source, but through an indirect platform. Currently, by the way, for age under 35, that's already 70% of news consumption, so already a pretty high number. And other things in there are the fact that news is predominantly local, and there is a lot of societal pressure on news that we also in every scenario expect to increase, e.g. pressure on journalists, journalist safety, etc. Top right is the uncertainties, so it could go either way. And we use those to construct our scenarios. still a lot of uncertainties in that box, so we clustered them. And I don't expect you to read all this. I see that's a pretty small print. This is about the two big green arrows. The first one is the role of the technology platforms, and those could be either social media platforms or specific news platforms in news. On the one hand, it could be that these dominate the news sector, e.g. News is predominantly consumed through technology platforms and no longer through magazines, newspapers, television, etc. Or on the other hand, it's one of the channels and sources of news in a diverse set of news outlets. And on the other big green arrow, it's about trust. And associated to trust also news avoidance. So on the one hand, a lot of people that distrust news and avoid news. On the other hand, a continued trust in news and in journalism, and therefore also a broad interest in different sources of news and viewpoints and opinions. So that's the basis of our scenarios, and I'll come back to all the different things on the slides a little bit when I describe the 4 scenarios in a little more detail. So if you put those 2 green arrows like this, this is what you got, the 4 quadrants, and in each quadrant, logically, one of the scenarios pops up. Let me describe them briefly. Hit the button one more time. Here they are. So, let's start top left. We've called that multidimensional tribes. This is a world, a potential world in 2030, and that is one where there is low trust in journalism, a relatively high level of news avoidance, and a diverse set of news outlets. Maybe the amount of news outlets that we have today, as I said, with newspapers, magazines, radio, television, technology platforms, etc. In this world, people predominantly look at their own source of news, the one they trust, and maybe the only one they trust, and they distrust other sources. So, as somebody put it in Dutch, verzuiling on steroids. That means that news providers struggle because their audience is relatively small. It consists of small groups of people. That means that they really have to specifically target that group. They use the level and of filter bubbling and echo chambers in those groups is relatively high. Siloed thinking, and that's why we call it a little bit of tribe-like behavior, with possibly also some polarization ongoing in society. There is technology, but it's not used, for example, for increasing transparency or authenticity in news. As one of my American colleagues said, Jan-Piet, your scenarios are all quite extreme. At the same time, they're all plausible, and this one I think is already happening in the Midwest of the United States. Now, that was his quote, and he's an American, not mine, but maybe there is some truth in that. Oh, that's too quick. The other, I should stay on this page. The top right scenario, let me go to that one. A scenario where in 2030 there is a high trust in news, broad interest in news, and also still a diverse set of news outlets. We've called it news utopia because in our opinion it would be great if we would end up in that scenario. On the other hand, if we've done our work right, and if these axes are really truly uncertain, then the likelihood of ending up top right is 25%. Sometimes I do an exercise with, let's say, an audience here where I ask them, what scenario do you think is going to happen in 2030? And people each have their preference, or they think what's going to happen, and then I end up saying, trick question, because if we've done our work right, you can't judge where you're going to think. It's in the middle. time will tell. Anyway, news utopia is an area where it's either developed by itself or the regulator has developed a relatively level playing field. Where there is lots of opportunity for different news outlets to make a decent living, continue their operations in high quality, good pluralism, good accessibility also for people. It's easy to access diverse set of news, and it's also easy to do fact-checking. The possibility in this scenario is that because of high trust and good news environment is that consumers get a bit lazy and less critical, and therefore that may be something to watch out for. The one on the bottom right we've called benevolent big tech. Benevolent meaning doing good big tech. So in this scenario, technology platforms dominate news, either in news generation, certainly in distribution. At the same time, this is combined with a relatively high level of trust, and that's because these tech platforms or news platforms put society and societal developments first. So they do a lot to increase transparency, increase quality, and put a lot of technology and enablers to that end. So a lot of artificial intelligence, technology, to create trust and transparency. At the same time, a high level of consolidation, likely only a few platforms survive. Maybe even towards what is now in the music industry, Spotify and not many others, which obviously also has a risk in itself for, e.g., pluralism. And the last one we've called ignorance is bliss. This is a scenario where distrust is relatively high, and news avoidance is relatively high. Now, we pride ourselves that in the Netherlands there is relatively high trust in news. Research says 56% of the people have trust in news. And we can pride ourselves that we're among the top countries in the world. At the same time, I sometimes feel that means that if 56% has trust in news, there's almost half of the people don't. And that number is increasing. So even though we're doing good on the planet, we're still, I believe, have something to worry about. And that's also one of the basis why we did this study. And on the left-hand side of this page, that comes out. Distrust, news avoidance, and in the bottom left combined with a scenario where big tech or technology platforms dominate. So those technology platforms have small and or fragmented audiences, means they have to produce news and distribute news at the lowest possible cost, lots of AI, possibly also a lot of filter bubbles, and possibly easy to distribute disinformation because it's difficult to make money with news. There will be startups trying, but at the same time, it'll also be difficult in this type of world because there is so much distrust and it's difficult to make money. To summarize, those are our 4 scenarios, and then we looked in those scenarios, what would be the value of news? How can we measure value of news in those scenarios against measurements like inclusivity, pluralism, accessibility, quality, as we just discussed, independence of news, and transparency of news? And how could we as society, individuals, government, or companies active in the news ecosystem increase those things in those different scenarios? So that was our next step. How could we increase it? And can we identify initiatives to keep the value of news as high as possible? Now, that's where I stop.
Thank you, Jan-Piet. that was a lot of content. Indeed, after we identified the 4 scenarios, we went back to the experts, internal and external experts, and we talked with them about initiatives that we could look at to strengthen the value of news. And Maaike, may I ask you to tell us a bit more about those initiatives?
Yeah, thank you very much. Together with many of you, we actually then made a list of activities that could be done or maintained that would influence somehow how these 2 axes actually would start to develop. And I'm not going to say that all these initiatives are going to be completely novel. I think what the strength also is of the dialogue that we had was that many initiatives are there, sometimes as smaller kernels of activity, sometimes already broader initiatives in the industry, and that we actually say, yeah, if you would continue on that path, that would actually strengthen the value of news overall. Of course, everybody would then also say, yeah, but whose responsibility is it in the end? Who should do this? Well, we have in the larger report that you all have a copy of, indicated for each of the initiatives that we highlight, who could play a role in that. And we really feel that that is up to the stakeholders and actors in this domain to pick up some of the initiatives or to actually accelerate some of them that are happening. Next to that, we spoke about what regulations can do. I think you're probably all familiar with the developments in Europe and in the Netherlands and other countries where national legislation is being developed around news, around authenticity, about all kind of use of artificial intelligence. We feel that these initiatives are very good. The regulations that develop, that is a positive development in itself, that there's attention from government and European initiatives around Europe fit for the digital age to actually come to kind of boundary conditions. But we also feel that initiatives that are really starting within society are probably going to be faster and more carried throughout society and have a better chance of success and creating impact. So after we made a long list of initiatives, we focused on a few, the 6 that you see on this slide, and said we will work out some more elements of how they influence the value of news. And we said, well, for example, for the first one, digital media and education programs. This is partly happening, but we really feel there is a need to strengthen this and continue to do this much more. A larger part of many generations, this goes across generations, does not have easy access to the news sources of today, to novel news sources, or do not know how to handle them or interpret them. So starting initiatives around education in communities, at schools, here at Beeld en Geluid, I think there's also initiatives going on there to train younger people on what it means to get your news from the media online. It's definitely going to be creating an environment in which news will be more accessible, and it is also more democratized actually for people to have access. Well, and then when you have access, we also said, well, we need to help people to understand what they're looking at and need to help them develop a critical mindset. So to actually be critical of what they read online. And that's the second one, the critical thinking initiative. In the critical thinking initiative, we can think about pop-ups, for example, that show up before you read something, that enable somebody to pause and think, like, what am I really going to look at now? What is the source of this? Can I trust this source? Trust plays a big role in this item as well. And can I actually make a decision more autonomous to continue to read this source, maybe knowing what I know when I reflect on it a little, and not just immediately jump into the content. We feel that pop-ups like that, which are common on some platforms, are starting to develop, will help to actually increase the critical thinking mindset of news consumers. And then when we talk about the news consumers online, what influences people a lot without them often knowing, I think about 40% of the people who consume online news have no idea about what is happening in the background, which algorithms are there to actually channel the news towards you, to give you a certain feed of news that is tailored to your preferences, tailored to where you have looked at a bit longer, or tailored to the sources that you are used to in terms of how the layout is, etc. And those algorithms we feel should be transparent, should be really, for consumers it should be clear that there is potential bias in how these algorithms select news items for you. And we feel that having transparency on that is actually now a good topic, because now is the momentum there, with also the big platforms highlighting it as an important topic and showing willingness to be transparent about algorithms and how they are composed. If you stick with those algorithm topics, you quickly end up with your own bubble of news. And when you're in your own bubble of news, you lack the pluriformity that is so important to get multiple perspectives on news, to have an objective view on that. And therefore, one of the other initiatives highlights the pluriformity of news aggregators, to have different sources of news and provide access to people through different sources. Examples of those are there in the Netherlands as well, like Blendel. Then another item is, where did my news come from? The source and the proof of provenance. Is there evidence that the news that I consume is really the original news item, or has it been edited? And what is the source? Modern technology can help there as well, to actually create blockchain, for example, as evidence, and use that to show authenticity or where it has been edited. It's all about transparency and awareness there. And then one of the other items that we feel is important to maintain, and where we are really optimistic on how this is organized, at least we heard that in the roundtables in the Netherlands, is funding for independent news outlets. To have independence, to have that perspective that is there without a certain influence that creates the news item or colors it. So when we bring this all together, I think we look at 6 potentially powerful initiatives, which are partly already having their kernels in society. And when we build on those, we have a strong belief from all the information we got and input from the roundtables, that if stakeholders would take these initiatives further, that we will be able actually, on these 2 axes, especially also the one on trust, to make an impact and to move further on maintaining the value of news in our society.
Thank you, Maaike and Jan-Piet. Before we change seats with our second guests of this afternoon, are there any questions? We have time for one question, potentially. I see, oh yeah, I have something that's...
Yes, my name is Frank Visser from Media Perspectives. I have a question about the matrix. Could it be that there will be different parts of society that exist in different parts of the matrix? So, for instance, some people would be able to exist in top right, while others would exist in a world where bottom left dominates. I won't repeat the terminology because I don't know them from my mind, but you
I understand your question.
do, but can you say something about that?
Yeah, so there is no, let's say, black and white outcome of these scenarios in 2030. What you typically see is that society will drift in a certain direction, e.g. to top right, but it will also have elements of the scenario in the bottom right and the top left. Generally not totally on the opposite sides of the spectrum. Unless maybe you live in a very big country like the US, I don't foresee that happening. The powerful thing about scenario planning is also that when you describe these scenarios, you can also describe the path towards 2030 for those scenarios. And then when you come to 24, 25, 26, and you see things happening, you start to realize, society is moving in this direction. Not maybe fully black and white, that one scenario, but that direction, and that will then allow you to understand the world around you better and take the appropriate action.
Thank you. At the end of the session, there is also room for some more questions. I would like to thank you for now and welcome two other guests that we have here, Peter and Arno.
Thank you, Nathalie.
So, sorry.
So,
Sleeping
welcome. We are going to hear some initiatives in practice. Peter, let's start with you. You're from the Dutch Journalism Fund, or
Correct.
Stimuleringsfonds voor de Journalistiek. Can you tell us a bit more about this organization?
Yeah, of course. I think it's quite a Dutch thing to have this. In a more international perspective, it is very common to have funds that particularly fund stories. So you can go to a fund and get your journalism story made. But what we focus on is strengthening the infrastructure of the journalism sector in the Netherlands. So making sure that there are organizations where stories are made that actually reach a public, and also that there are organizations surrounding that infrastructure to help news organizations make their stories better, faster, with more impact.
Okay. Mike told us about some initiatives that were identified in the report. I think we are also aware that there are already great initiatives out there in the market. Your organization also supports some of those projects. Yep. Can you give some examples?
Yeah, maybe there is a slide we can show on that. Perfect. Because I think there are dozens of projects that we support within different news organizations on a national, regional, local level each year. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is just to show I think the breadth of everything we do. But maybe, for example, I can connect them to some of the initiatives that you have spoken about in your report. Let me highlight two out of the top of my head. The first one would be Drog, or called in English Bad News. And I think it connects very well to the critical thinking initiative that you have posed. Mm-hmm. You talked about the pop-ups that you can show that help and make people aware of fake news. What they have decided is there was already a lot of effort in the second decade of the 2000s to protect people from fake news by doing fact-checking and all of that. And what Drog did is that they looked at the other side of the equation. So they said, okay, disinformation is out there, misinformation is out there. How can we make people more resistant to disinformation? And what they kind of wanted to do, and it was a less loaded term back in 2017 when they started, but they wanted to make a fake news vaccine. So what they did is they made a game, the Bad News game, in which you can play around with being a disinformation specialist to see how the mechanics behind it work, so that the next time you see an article come by on social media that is actually misinformation or really purposeful disinformation, you can recognize it and be like, nope, I'm going to skip that. And that actually has some wonderful results also on the long term for news users. And maybe quickly, another one, the funding of independent news outlets. That's always a thing. Yep. I think that's also on many levels you can look at it. You can look at it on a more basic level. So do you have any news? And on a more broader level, do you have innovation? Do you reach different target audiences and all that? And I think on the highest level, we always talk a lot about investigative journalism. I also heard here again the watchdog. That is what we really want, but especially on the local and a regional level, that is very hard to accomplish because it's extremely expensive. So what RTV Nov is doing with money from our grant program is that they are looking at collaboration between a local broadcaster and a regional broadcaster to see if you can make a business case for investigative journalism by collaboration. So I think that's also a way for us to support those kinds of initiatives.
Thank you. That's really nice examples of projects that you are supporting. So I was wondering, all those projects, are they standalone projects or are they in a certain way aligned with each other?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good question, and I think that's also where it comes into play that we need to change up our game a little bit. We also did a scenario study, but then we looked at 2035, so we looked a little bit further down the road. And I think what that deepens in comparison to your study, because they align very well, is because we look at 2035, you have to zoom out a little bit to still get the bigger picture. And I think the bigger picture is almost the same. You look at the role of trust and tech in journalism, and what we get is, because we zoom out, you get trust and tech in society as a whole, and how does journalism work within that society. And you can kind of see that it becomes a set of wicked problems for which there is no one solution, but you need to work on it on a regulatory level, on an infrastructure level, and on a consumer level. Otherwise, it's never going to work. Just like, I love the fake news vaccine. I'm really proud of what the people at Trog are doing. But just making people resistant to fake news is not enough to solve the entire disinformation problem. So maybe we can show our next slide for a little bit.
Of course.
This is how we always used to work. We used to start with grant programs. They were always open grant programs, and we would just say, come with an idea. We're going to let, in very good Dutch, I think this also works in English, we're going to let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? And then we'll see what happens. And if we can help people get their ideas to the next level through coaching, that's great. And if there's time left over, we can share the knowledge that has been gained through individual project with the sector. And what I want to do is, I hope the animation works. Can you click it one more time for the special effect?
I don't think so.
Oh no! It doesn't work. It's supposed to turn around. So now we want to start with the knowledge part. Basically what we say is, and I think the scenario studies are an excellent starting point for this, identify what are the key problems that are playing in the sector. Can we gather as much knowledge about those as possible? Or can we do new research on it, for example? Work together with universities and other kinds of research facilities. Get the knowledge out there. See if we can help people through coaching to implement that knowledge in the real world. And then when we really have a blueprint of best practices, then make sure we subsidize the first people in how that works. And I think from that we can take away some of the risk for the market to find everything out for themselves, because innovation is a tricky thing, which I think Arno will tell something about next, and then the marketplace can take over.
Wow, that's an excellent bridge to
You're welcome.
to Arno. Arno, welcome. Next to your role as a Chief Transformation Officer at the Talpa Network, you're also leading an industry-wide coalition. I think in our report we described the implementation of initiatives would benefit from support of an industry-wide coalition, and I think you are the perfect guest to tell us a bit more about the coalition that you are leading.
Yeah, what a coincidence! What a nice bridge. Thank you. Maybe I can just quickly show you how we come to the agenda. So the industry agenda coming from innovation. So that's I would say, what we try to get to is a blueprint and consensus over the larger media companies. So that goes over TV, radio, and print, which is basically the large news outlets, which pretty much reach all Dutch citizens within, I would say, a week's time. And the reason why we came to a central agenda for innovation, because that has never been done before, is basically the state of the internet, I would say, and the disruptive powers of the internet for the media sector for the last 2 decades. So the first decades, you could say, we were pretty much disrupted by search. Second by social media, and we got together and said, okay, if we don't want to face the same issue again, that in 10 years' time, we say, why didn't we partner up for things that are pre-competitive, right? So in that scope, we did a bottom-up scenario. So often in innovation, you see like industry committees get together and come up with an idea, which is all great on paper. And then you need to get it funded, and the funding stays small. So we said, okay, let's do it the reverse. Let's do a bottom-up scenario. So we started out, which was quite sensitive, because we said to all these media organizations, disclose your innovation agenda, which is not typically is something they do by nature. And when we analyzed that through media perspectives, they played a great role in that, is we analyzed 81 innovation projects, all with budgets behind it. And then we just said, okay, you know, what are the commons here? And then we came to 3 groups. So the 3 groups, they're tied into one agenda, but they could be standalone. And we already see overlapping parts of these groups, which I think is very exciting. First was very clear, the data infrastructure. You know, the reason why algorithms got so powerful and why the winner-takes-all platforms are the ones we're trying to challenge is because we're too, I would say, weak on our own data infrastructure. So that got together quite quickly. The second one was the content. We say from a media perspective, as media companies, we do 2 things. We entertain. So this is the entertainment part of storytelling. That's the content group. So there's the large entertainment production houses. And the third group is the part where we are newsmakers, where we tell stories and we inform people. The other part of our media business. And that group got together as well, basically on the same topics again. So looking at the 6 initiatives, you know, we can plot them all in the 3 groups that we defined as we speak. We had a morning session, so it's all very actual happening today. Where we try to get to is to a common agenda, parts that we actually feel that can accelerate by doing it together rather than, you know, doing small pieces independently. And the reason for that is regulation is always retrospectively trying to fix things, and innovation is the opposite of regulation, where, you know, if we take an outlook whether it's 2030 or 2035, we all agree on where we want to be and what we think is important. It's just innovation is not a sprint race, I always say, it's a marathon. I always use the metaphor of the triple jump, right? So it's easy to see where we want to be. The difficult part is what we do tomorrow and what do we do next year. And I think partnering up, you know, with science, with education, the things that happened over the last couple of months, I feel is very exciting because a whole lot of things come together.
Indeed, it's very exciting to see all things that's happening in your organization also, taking a different stand and a different strategy. There's a lot of things happening. If you look at those initiatives, why did you choose news? Was that a common denominator, or is that because there are some challenges?
Very simple. Out of the 81 projects that were listed as important and part of the innovation agenda of the independent companies, a lot of them were about news. And the worries that we had about independent journalism, the role of journalism in society.
Yeah. So, and any specific trends do you want
I think it's on the next slide. I won't take a lot of time because these are the 9 agenda points on the next slide. Out of the whole, so step 1 here is the data vault that we're trying to get to, which is the other axe, you know, trying to depower big tech, trying to be more independent and get data ownership by to the users rather than big tech platforms. Pillar 2, 3, and 4 are within the news group. So it's about fake news on the one hand, pluralism of news on the other hand, and the third one is how to reach difficult audiences, how to keep them connected to news. And I think the common denominator in that is trust, which is the other axis of your model. There you go.
So you mentioned that this morning you came together as a group. What's the status at this moment of this initiative or this project? Is there already any concrete projects identified, or?
No, we're still in planning phase. Obviously, there's a lot of ideas, all the examples here. There's a lot of examples. We try to look at what's already there, right? We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. So a lot of time will be spent over the next couple of weeks and months on talking to initiatives that are already there, trying to see if we can amplify them rather than and accelerate them. And I think the reason why that's important is because if you go to for the triple dump, you need government funding. You need all those siloed, because the science world is siloed from the educational world, from the business world, and etc. So if we cross those silos, the third step, or the third jump, or the triple jump, is like, it's huge. And what we try to get to is, how do we bring that back to investment levels? Because it's easier to tell the government we need X million euros if the industry pays half of it. So we're trying to get to things that are tangible, we can do tomorrow, while not forgetting where we want to be in the next step. So it's an approach what we're trying to get to right now, so that we can go back to the CEOs of the media companies saying, this is the part where I would say the responsibility, because I also think that's where I started, because in history it's been tried before to get competing media companies to work on a joint agenda. And I think the difference is now the momentum is there, but also the sense of responsibility. You know, being a media company in a world that polarizes, day by day. Media plays an important role in informing those audiences. So if we get disconnected and there's distrust, there's a responsibility for media companies to try their utmost to make sure.
So that might be the reason that, as you mentioned in the past, there have been some collaborations between some media companies, which maybe not have been always that successful, but the reason that it will succeed this time is because there's momentum and responsibility that
I fundamentally believe there's momentum right now from all those silos to make sure that change happens.
That's very exciting. How does success look like in your view?
Well, I think what we're doing now and the pace that we have and the evolution over the last couple of months is exciting, but the proof is in the pudding, as they say. So we need to. I think success is if in 10 years' time I walk on the streets and I join Jan Piet and saying, "Remember that we all have these plans and scenarios," and and I feel this is an obligation, towards next generation. Even if we have 10 ideas and 8 of them fail, at least we've covered 2 of them.
And you mentioned also, how does it work in practice, this collaboration? Because you collaborate, but at the same time, you're also competitors, right? So.
Yeah, but we don't compete over reach, over revenues and all the stuff that is there in markets. We compete in the fact, or it's pre-competitive when we have a joint goal to trust equals transparency. So all the things, what is a fact, what is not a fact, how do you interpret the fact, and what is an opinion, that transparency. If one media outlet does a trial on that, we never know whether it would, if it fails, we never know whether it would fail if we do it across the whole industry. So I think the appetite for innovation and spending serious amounts of budget to something new is easier to do when you do it all together.
Absolutely.
So I think the pre-competitive part is the big difference, where it's all about new things that we don't want to compete over standards in 5 years. So if we each do our own transparency tool, then you have 5 transparency tools, and then we need to explain to people what the difference between the tools is.
And this coalition, is the idea to broaden the coalition with more organizations that might be interested to join, or how?
No, well, for now, we keeping everyone together. I think the big win is that, and that's I think even worldwide unique, that we have all public and private companies together, which makes the story even more powerful. So the goal is to get to so we know what we want to do. The next step is how do we want to do it and who's going to pay for it, and then it's helpful that the larger corporation say, okay, we feel that we can invest X amount of money in this triple step approach. And then obviously in execution it's going to be way broader than just these companies. Yeah.
So Peter, if you listen to Arno's story, what do you see happening in terms of collaboration?
That's a good question. I think we are very open to collaborating, and I think our stories, even though we really didn't talk about this before, fit together quite nicely. We can do kind of the pre-stage of finding out what exactly should we focus on. Is there some kind of consensus? We can be an independent organization that looks at, even though there are certain commercial points of views that you need to take into consideration, what would be best for journalism for each generation, for society. I think we would be happy to facilitate whatever the industry is doing, because we are still, I know in English it's the Dutch Journalism Fund, but in Dutch it's the Stimuleringsfonds. So we stimulate. We don't own the entire sector. The only thing we can do is help steer nudge in the right direction every once in a little while. And I'm really happy that the industry, the sector, is ready to take the wheel.
Well, exciting times ahead, I would say. Thank you for educating us about this initiative. I can imagine that there might be some questions. Could you do the question in English?
Sure, yes. So what you see on the study from Monitor, right, is that the authenticity and the trustworthiness of the sources, you would annotate those with a tool or something else. I think that's very much open to interpretation, right? How companies use that at the very end. So what I wonder is, what's the gap between pre-competitive, setting the standard, and then you need to step away because then you're in a competitive area again. And then how do you then monitor what happened with your ideas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. These are exactly the questions that are currently, as a matter of fact, this morning. So exactly this, there was a couple of people from investigative journalism. If you look at the scenarios, because the difficult part about answering this question, so I don't have an answer on this question, is there one fact or are there 5 facts? If you look at the scenarios, the top left one, there's multiple tribes with multiple facts. So that there could be, I always say, if you look at the disruption of the web, it's more about the fact that on the utopia scenario in this case, which we all feel very comfortable with, because you have one identity, one currency, and one governance, right? A country, government, one currency, and one identity. In a digital world, there's people with 10 identities, have 10 currencies. And the question is how do we govern that? And I think for journalism, that's where we as an industry look at, the journalists, for that question, and saying, how do you bridge, through that trust factor, between government, the control one, and us, the citizen, as well as the companies. Because you will have so competition, yes, what you use as a story, what you use as sources is extremely important. We had I think a practical example, which was an eye-opener for me, because I always felt that news, out of these 3 groups, was almost 100% societal rather than economical value, right? Even though we're companies, and whether we're commercial companies, it's profit, right? If you're a non-profit company, it's still budget, it's still costs, and you can spend that €1 once. If you look at, how do you disclose, whether you disclose who your sources are or not, explaining what you've done, who you've spoken to, next to the article itself, takes 3 times the amount of times, maybe 10 times. That means the cost for that one article is times 10. If it's already hard, in the current economy to make a profit or to get budgets to get journalism, that means in 10 years' time, it's 10 times more difficult. Who's going to pay for that? Is that government? Is that the market? So it's extremely relevant question, which I think is the source of what we need to solve. Where does competition ends, and where is it societal value that we need to get done?
Thanks.
Maybe do we have a question online?
Even via jou.
Yes. Ga je.
All right, so one question online is regarding the economy of the quality media journalism ecosystem. What kind of recommendation does the study do for creating fair markets? Or on the Deloitte study. So who's the one?
I think I found Jan-Piet.
Wow, that's a difficult question. Can you repeat it?
What kind of recommendation does the study do for creating fair markets around quality media journalism ecosystem?
Fair markets.
I think we said what's required is a well-functioning news ecosystem, which I think implies a fair market where if you're either a news generator or distributor, you can hold your own, make enough money to produce, good quality news. We also recognize that in some scenarios that may not be the case. So one of the initiatives is that maybe if that happens to become true, that government subsidizes, for example, small niche news outlets. And that could be the situation, for example, in the scenario where technology platforms dominate the market. There's a lot of consolidation, there's less pluriformity, and where as a society you feel it's important to keep up that pluriformity and then subsidize different news producers.
Are there any more questions? One more question.
If I may.
Yeah, or
there you go.
Thank you. Also on the Deloitte study, so is there anything in the research about data-driven workflows in journalism?
Data-driven workflows in journalism.
Yeah, and then it also says, so decisions in journalism storytelling based upon data of users' usage.
I think I'm not an expert on data-driven workflows for journalists, but what the last part, based on users, I think is very interesting, and that we have in the study, for example, a suggestion that the algorithms used to present news to news consumers should be more open. So yes, there is a lot of data about users, especially on news platforms and social platforms, and all of that data is used to decide what news you present either to Peter or to Arno. And because Peter and Arno's friends are different, because their preferences are different, they see different news sets. Maybe that's a good idea, but maybe it's not a good idea. And can Peter, for example, influence that algorithm, or at least know what the algorithm is doing? That's one stage. The second stage could be, can he influence the algorithm by saying, you're presenting me this kind of news, but I'd like to be more diverse. And then thirdly, maybe he can every now and then reset the algorithm and say, forget what I looked at in the past, forget what my friends are looking at, I want to start over. And I think that is important, that we gain as individuals a little bit more power back to what is presented to us, so we can each make our own decision.
Thank you. Are there also any initiatives, I think, supported by
I think
Journalism Fund?
I was also thinking about the last couple of questions. Maybe I can make a little bit of a link between them through one of our projects. Tech is not some sort of end goal. It is a tool. I think that's also how you talk about it. And when you look at stuff like journalism, it's very easy to talk about, like if you talk about a fair market, it's almost always talking about journalism as a cost. But I think one of the things we should be focusing on is journalism as a business model, and that often requires a different way of looking at things. For example, there has been a lot of time spent on, first there was a lot of time spent on moderating the reactions that came to underneath articles on news websites. And that was, firstly, it's very expensive because there was a lot of bad stuff coming up. And also it's not very nice work because you have to sift through Nazism and all that kind of stuff all day as your work, which no one wanted to do. So basically all the news outlets closed those options to react on the news. The Volkskrant, one of the Dutch largest newspapers, came to me and said, well, we feel like we are now lacking audience engagement. And I think audience engagement is one of the prime drivers for trust. If you can engage with your audience, you can get them to trust you. And they were like, we are losing that engagement because there's no opportunity to react anymore. Can we use AI to bring back the moderation facilities without having to pay a lot of people a lot of money to do terrible work? To which I said, we could do that, but first let's look at what actually is the benefit of those reactions. They went and talked to users. 90% of the users did not want to react underneath an article. They did not like it. They felt like not the whole world needs to know what I want to say on this topic. But what I do want is to contribute to this news brand that I care about, the Volkskrant. So instead of reopening the reactions, they opened a open newsroom, and they have asked, when you are talking about the data workflows, they have asked their users to contribute data so they can make news stories, and the news stories that come out of that have a much higher audience engagement, impact, and convert many more subscriptions than regular articles do. And I think if you can turn those kinds of systems on their head, you have real innovations that not only cost money out of some sort of I have a societal responsibility, but also add something to your business model through journalism.
Thank you for this example. We're on over time already. I would like to thank my colleagues Jan-Piet and Maaike, and of course Peter and Arno to be with us today. If you would like to read more, the study can be downloaded on the Deloitte website. Thank you very much again, and have a nice day.